Let me tell you something strange about introversion. We live in a world that treats personality like a personal choice, as if you woke up one day and decided to be quieter, softer, more inward, as if being an introvert was a preference, not a history. And yet, beneath that assumption, there is a question that lingers quietly for many people. What if your introversion didn't begin with you at all? We grow up hearing that some people are just born that way, shy, reserved, independent, but that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play. One that has less to do with temperament alone, and more to do with the environment that shaped your nervous system long before you knew what personality was. See, for some people, introversion isn't about loving solitude. It's about learning it early. It's about discovering, often unconsciously, that being quiet was safer than being expressive, that observing was safer than interrupting, that staying in your inner world required less negotiation than trying to be understood in the outer one. You can see it in small moments. You hesitate before speaking, even when you know what you want to say. You rehearse conversations internally. You feel drained not by people themselves, but by the effort of adjusting to them. From the outside, it looks like preference, but internally, it often began as adaptation. Psychologists have found something fascinating here. Children don't just develop personalities in isolation, they develop strategies, ways of being that help them stay regulated, connected, or unnoticed, depending on what the environment demands. And for many introverted adults, that strategy formed early, in homes where space was limited not physically, but emotionally. It's not always dramatic, sometimes it's subtle. Parents who were loving but distracted, caregivers who were present but overwhelmed. Homes where emotions existed but weren't mirrored, where being easy was praised more than being expressive, where you learn that needs were better managed quietly. And here's the reframe. It's not about your parents doing something wrong. It's about how the nervous system learns. When a child senses that expression creates tension, or that emotions aren't fully received, the psyche adjusts. It turns inward. It becomes self-contained. Not as rebellion, but as intelligence. It's not about being antisocial. It's about being self-regulating. You might recognize this pattern. You learned early how to entertain yourself, how to disappear into books, imagination, thinking. You became comfortable alone not because you preferred it, but because it was familiar, predictable, safe, and over time, that familiarity began to feel like identity. But here's what's often misunderstood. Introversion shaped this way isn't the absence of social desire. It's the presence of emotional caution. You're not uninterested in people. You're attuned to the cost of connection, to the effort of explaining yourself, to the subtle exhaustion of being misread. For many, this shift happens quietly, not in a single moment, but across years. You stop reaching outward automatically. You start checking inward first. You learn to be your own witness, your own companion, because somewhere along the way, that was more reliable. Carl Jung spoke about this when he described introversion not as shyness, but as a turning inward of psychic energy, a movement toward the inner world when the outer one feels too demanding or too intrusive. And for some people, that turn inward was encouraged long before it was chosen. Because let's be honest, families don't just raise children. They set emotional climates. And children are exquisitely sensitive to those climates. They feel what can be said, what should be withheld, what disrupts harmony, and often, introversion begins as respect for those unspoken rules. Think about it. When was the first time you decided it was easier not to share? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you sensed it wouldn't land. Because it might be ignored, or misunderstood, or turned into something else. That moment matters. But not all introversion comes from constraint. And here's where the complexity deepens. Some parents were simply quiet themselves. emotionally internal, loving, but not expressive, and children learn how to relate by mirroring. If connection happens through presence rather than words, through proximity rather than dialogue, the child learns that inwardness is normal. In that case, introversion isn't a wound, it's inheritance. And this is where the paradox begins. The same upbringing that taught you to be inward may have also given you depth, sensitivity, the ability to sit with your thoughts, to feel nuance, to notice what others miss. You learned to read rooms because you had to. You learned to listen because speaking wasn't always the center, but there's also a cost. Because growing up inward in a world that rewards outwardness can feel like being out of sync. You may have learned to equate visibility with danger, attention with pressure, expression with exposure. So even as an adult, you hesitate not because you lack confidence, but because your system remembers. And here's what's often misunderstood. People assume introverts are simply low energy, or uninterested, or detached, but many introverted adults are deeply relational. They feel intensely, they think profoundly. They just learned early that connection requires selectivity. There's a philosophical layer here. Because identity isn't just who you are, it's who you were allowed to be. And when a child learns that their full expression doesn't quite fit, they won't disappear. They condense. They become smaller internally, but denser, like a star collapsing into itself. And yet, not all inwardness is peace. Some of it is protection. Because some parents weren't just quiet. They were unpredictable, critical, emotionally unavailable. In those environments, introversion becomes armor. Silence becomes safety. Withdrawal becomes control. And the child learns that being unseen is better than being hurt. Both truths can exist at once. Introversion can be wisdom, and it can be defense. The work of adulthood isn't to erase introversion. It's to understand where it came from, to ask gently, am I quiet because I choose to be? Or because I learned that speaking wasn't safe? Science supports this nuance. Research on temperament and attachment shows that children adapt their emotional expression to match caregiver responsiveness. Sensitive children, in particular, turn inward when overstimulation isn't buffered. Their nervous systems don't shut down, they go deeper. Safety changes everything. When an introverted adult finally feels safe internally or relationally, something shifts. Expression begins to emerge naturally, not loudly, not performatively, but clearly. Words arrive without urgency. Presence becomes grounded instead of guarded, and sometimes this confuses others. People say you've changed, that you're distant or colder. But what they re-noticing is this: you no longer managing the emotional climate for everyone else. Maybe that's what maturity looks like, not becoming louder, but becoming congruent. Not abandoning introversion but inhabiting it consciously. In a culture that tells us confidence must be visible, choosing inwardness becomes quietly radical. You stop measuring worth by volume. You stop equating presence with performance. You allow your inner world to be enough. There's something almost sacred about that. Because not everything meaningful needs an audience. Some parts of you were formed in quiet for a reason. Some insights only arrive when no one is watching. So if you recognize yourself here, you don't need to rewrite your story. You don't need to blame your parents. You don't need to fix your introversion. Awareness doesn't demand correction. It invites integration. Maybe your parents didn't make you an introvert. Maybe they taught you how to listen inward before the world taught you how to speak. And maybe that's not a limitation. Maybe it's a depth the world is still learning how to hear. If this reflection resonated, you can leave a quiet comment below. Or don't. Perhaps it's enough to simply feel recognized for a moment. Because being introverted doesn't mean being closed off. Sometimes, it means you learned early how to stay connected to yourself. And in a world that never stops talking, that might be one of the most profound things of all.